Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Kahane from Reos Partners. I'm recording this conversation from Montreal, where the snow is melting and spring is on the way. It feels like a good time to be thinking ahead. In our online activities this week, Reos is exploring the subject of democracy, and in particular, what we and our partners are learning about what it takes to build more resilient democracies. If you're interested in this topic, my colleagues and I will be sharing strategies used around the world to strengthen democracy at an upcoming webinar, Collaborating for Resilient Democracy, which will be held on March 25th, and I'll share more details about this event later in this video. But today, I'm happy to be here with Melissa Spatz, who's doing important work in the United States to build a healthy democracy that works for all. Melissa is the director of the Piper Fund, a donor collaborative that unites individual donors and foundations to defend democratic institutions, protect the right to protest, and diminish the influence of corporate and special interest money on political and judicial systems. This month, Piper and Reos are starting a project that will bring together a diverse group of people who are all, in their different ways, working to strengthen democracy in the US, and so I thought she would be a perfect person for me to interview about what it takes to build more resilient democracies. So welcome, Melissa.
Hi, nice to be here with you, Adam.
Uh, Melissa, the first question I wanted to ask you is the basic one, which is from your perspective, and you see a lot and you've been at it for a while. From your perspective, what are the most important challenges facing democracy in the U.S.?
Sure. I think that there are at least three big trends that are intersecting right now that are creating any number of challenges. The first one, and I almost don't want to call it a trend because it's not new, but the first one I would name would be white supremacy and white nationalism. Right? That has always been part of US culture and has always impacted US democracy. But I think it's safe to say that over the last few years, it's been emboldened. Right. And so what we're seeing is a belief that US democracy is really only for white people, that people of color have no role in democracy. That shows up in assaults on voting rights, which are underway right now. It showed up in the attempts to undermine the outcome of the election through court cases that were seeking to throw out ballots from communities of color. And most notoriously showed up on January 6th, right, in the insurrection at the Capitol with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and any number of white nationalist groups in attendance. So that's one whole set of issues we're facing. I think that is intersecting then with some of the work we're going to be doing together, which is around the oligarchic and corporate takeover of democracy. And what I'm referring to here is that to get their policies, economic policies passed, a handful of wealthy individuals and a set of corporations are willing to tear down democracy. They're willing to burn it down to get what it is that they want. And that shows up as corporate donations to candidates, wholesale takeovers of state government by the Koch brothers, and also in the recent attacks on voting rights, because there's a lot of evidence now documenting the corporate donation to legislators who are moving state level efforts to roll back voting rights. And the end result of that is that everyday Americans and in particular communities of color don't have a say in government. So that's a whole second set of pressures on democracy. And then I think, although in the US we tend to focus on what's happening just here, I think it's important to point to the third trend, which is the global rise of authoritarianism, right? And so what we've seen in other countries that's also unfolding in the US, whether it's attacks on protest rights, militarized policing, surveillance of activists, attacks on civil society, disinformation, attacks on judicial independence, all of that is unfolding here too. And these three, I think, are intersecting and taking place at multiple levels of government, right? So this is happening at the federal government, but also increasingly at the state and local government. And so we're in a pretty precarious position when you take all of that into account. I think we're in a kind of all hands on deck moment.
So you describe something which is, which is big and systemic and partly global and creates a precarious situation, as you say. So, what do you think are promising approaches to deal with this that are not just band-aids, but can reverse this, or can make democracy more resilient?
Sure. Well, before I get to that, I think it's important to say, because what I set out was pretty grim, that I think there are some reasons to be hopeful, and that's what we'll have to feed on, right, as we start responding. I think the record turnout for the last election is one of those things, and that was despite widespread voter suppression. We had huge turnout for the election, and the election functioned, right, in COVID. The public has a huge interest in engagement and in reform. And I know that at the Piper Fund, we have people knocking on our door looking for resources to advance proactive reform. And so I just want to put out there first that there's great reason to be hopeful. I think that in order to address the challenges, it kind of, as you framed it, Adam, can't be a Band-Aid response. I think we need to envision a different sort of democracy. We talk at Piper about envisioning an inclusive democracy where there's widespread participation by the communities that have been excluded. There's year-round participation, not only on election day, but a truly functioning democracy for the least represented folks. And I think that the approaches for that, therefore, have to come from those that are most impacted, right? It's communities of color, communities that don't have a voice in democracy need to be centered in what we're doing, and we need to build out support from there. And so, some examples that I could think of would be, there's been a lot of talk about Georgia and the extensive voter turnout in Georgia, both in the runoff election and in the election prior. And that really came from years of on-the-ground work. I mean, that doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen from national groups. It's the local groups in Georgia that made that happen. We've seen time and again that groups on the ground have innovative approaches. I'm thinking, for example, of an innovative approach in Seattle, Washington, that gives democracy vouchers to people, $25 certificates that you can use for candidates of your choice so that they're beholden to people and not corporations. And what I think is promising right now is that a lot of those kinds of approaches are appearing in federal legislation. So they're bubbling up from the ground, and we're starting to build out broader national coalitions that can take these ideas and move them at the federal level too. So the For the People Act that just passed the US House is now before the Senate includes voting rights, it includes money in politics reform. That kind of comprehensive approach, if tied to the work on the ground, can be, I think, very impactful.
You use the word coalition, and I'm conscious that the solution to authoritarianism isn't to impose a counter-authoritarianism, that something more inclusive is required. But I'm interested, who needs to be in coalition with whom? Who needs to collaborate with whom to advance this different approach? Because there are coalitions that have got us to where we are. So what's the coalition or what's the collaboration required to move things in a different direction? And I know you work a lot with philanthropists. What's the role of philanthropy in all of that?
Yeah, I think you're right. There are coalitions, and then there's work that's broader than a set coalition. And I think, the short answer is, we're at a crossroads right now where we have pro-democratic forces and anti-democratic forces. And that's why I said it's an all hands on deck moment. We need anyone who's pro-democracy to be working in the same direction. I think that, when I think about effective work across, not just within a coalition, but really across several sectors, what comes to mind for me is the work between November and January to ensure that the results of the election would hold.
Mm,
And that came through not so much a formal coalition, but a set of actors that started working much more collaboratively. So progressive groups with bipartisan groups, local and state groups with national groups, groups that took on specific aspects of the work. Piper worked on the right to protest during that period, but that was just one piece of the work, and we were careful to work in partnership with others. Communications and media narrative groups, and a pooled fund, right, that supported all of this work and made sure it was coordinated so that after the election, when you saw across the United States messaging around waiting for all the votes to be counted, counting all the votes, ensuring that the votes would be counted, everyone was marching in lockstep because everyone had been involved in a process to understand why that language was important. I think when it comes to philanthropy, that funders, the model that was used from November to January is a really good one of collaboration. There was a pooled fund, everyone approached it with a single goal in mind. I think that funders have some work to do. Some of this gets talked about a lot within philanthropy, so I won't be saying anything new, but I think it's still worth saying. Grantees need flexibility. They need to be able to respond to what's happening in the field, whether it's threats or opportunities. And what that means, and this is what's been said over and over, is long-term funding and general support
right.
funding that provides that flexibility. I think, though, that there's a little more than that. I think that we need to make resources available not just at the federal, national level, but at the state and local level, and in states that have been very under-resourced. And I think that most importantly, probably we need to break out of our silos. So
Yeah,
democracy groups are siloed because democracy funders are siloed,
right.
right? We fund in very narrow lanes. And until we learn to work collaboratively across those lanes and to move in one direction, the field won't be able to do what it needs to do.
Right. I'm really struck in listening to you, Melissa, the extent to which the strategies you think need to be pursued and the strategies you're pursuing to get more democracy are themselves more democratic. The great peace researcher Johan Galtung talks about end revealing means, and it strikes me that the means you are emphasizing reveal the ends that you're trying to move towards. So thank you very much for sharing your amazing and very important experience with us today. Melissa Spatz is the director of the Piper Fund, and for more information on what she's doing and what the Piper Fund is doing, you can visit their website, which is www.proteusfund, Proteus fund.org. As for Reos, our online activities this month will continue to explore the subject of democracy, to learn more about the strategies being used around the world to strengthen democracy in the US and in Europe and in Latin America and in Africa. Please register for our free webinar on March 25th. You'll find the link in this post or on our website, www.reospartners.com, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.